The story kicked off in a peaceful little village where a boy named Errol sat having lunch with his overly dramatic family. His dad couldn't stop shaking his head at how calm the kid looked, saying he barely slept a wink thinking about what kind of hero class his son might get. Meanwhile, his mom was hyped like it was Christmas morning, already imagining her son becoming some legendary warrior. His big sister, on the other hand, bragged that Errol would easily outshine every kid in school. His mom added that he'd probably have every girl chasing after him. That last part didn't sit right with the sister, who started worrying that her precious little brother might get stolen away by some random fangirl army. But Errol was the only sane one at that table. He already accepted that he was probably going to be average, just another background character in someone else's adventure. In this world, every child received a hero class on their 10th birthday, basically a divine gift from some higher being that decided your entire career path. These blessings could turn a regular kid into anything from a mighty warrior to a humble blacksmith. And that day, the school was packed with nervous students waiting to get classified, like they were loot boxes in an RPG. The priest began the ceremony by touching the forehead of the first kid, who immediately saw fiery hammers in his mind. The kid ran back to his dad screaming like he just pulled a 5-star weapon. Soon the priest started blessing everyone else in line. Then came the main event, Errol's turn. His sister whispered that he was definitely getting something amazing, and the whole family started cheering like it was a championship game. The entire crowd began whispering too, expecting the son of Sword Princess Farah and Archmage Leon to get some next-level class. I mean, with parents that stacked, it was basically nepotism waiting to happen. But life had other plans. Errol closed his eyes, waited for the divine image to appear, and saw absolutely nothing. Just pure darkness. The priest blinked in confusion, tried again, and then finally admitted that the boy had no class at all. Literally, no skill, no magic, no nothing. Just a rare case of a classless hero. The entire crowd went silent. His family, who were seconds away from throwing a party, instantly looked like they'd been told their son was a tax auditor. His mom and dad deflated, convinced they'd been scammed by the gods themselves. While his sister sat there trying to process that her future prodigy brother was now a certified failure.
The next morning, Errol picked up a wooden sword and went out to train like nothing happened. His parents assured him they wouldn't kick him out. Yeah, what loving support. He told them he'd be fine, that he didn't want a freeload, and his sister promised to cheer him on forever like a supportive fangirl. Errol reminded everyone that he had been training swordsmanship with his mom for years, so even if he had no fancy title, he wasn't useless. But deep down, he couldn't help thinking that his mother's idea of training was borderline child abuse. Every time they sparred, she sent him flying like a rag doll with her god-tier strength. Still, his mom was proud that he was so wise, and his dad started daydreaming about him getting a real job one day, like a proud parent watching their kid finally take out the trash. Seeing everyone fussing over him, Errol got tired of the pity party and decided to go train alone. When he reached the training grounds, he spotted 2 boys dueling. Both were proud holders of the swordsman class, showing off their shiny new skills. When they noticed Errol, they gave him the classic, "What's a loser like you doing here?" look. He told them he was just there to train, but they laughed it off, saying they didn't even need to train anymore since their class did all the heavy lifting. Then, with smug grins, they offered to show him how real swordsmen fight. And that's when Errol realized this was going to be a long, stupid day. As Errol stood on the sidelines watching those 2 wannabe swordsmen swing at each other, he couldn't help but notice how clean and flashy their moves looked. Their blades cut through the air with the kind of grace that only came from their shiny swordsman class. It was like watching 2 peacocks showing off feathers they didn't earn. Errol, who had no class whatsoever, decided he'd had enough of watching them flex, so he stepped forward and asked them for a duel. That single sentence was enough to make one of the boys choke on his own ego. He burst out laughing, calling Errol crazy for challenging someone who actually had a class. Errol, with the calmness of a monk and the confidence of a man who's had enough BS for one day, simply thought to himself that he didn't need some divine title to swing a sword. The insult stung, though, and the boy's pride couldn't take it. So he accepted the challenge, planning to teach the classless nobody a good lesson. Before starting, the swordsman reminded Errol to check his protection blessing, that invisible life shield everyone was born with, which recharged when they weren't taking damage. Errol gave a casual nod, basically saying, "Don't worry, bro, I won't die that easily," and told him to get ready for the duel.
Fueled by rage and pure teenage ego, the boy charged in screaming like a war hero, only for Errol to effortlessly parry his first swing like he was swatting a fly. The kid blinked in disbelief. He tried another strike, but Errol dodged again, locking blades in a clean counter. The second boy, watching, thought his friend was just playing around and yelled at him to finish it already. But the red-faced swordsman snapped back that Errol wasn't just some punching bag. The two clashed again, steel meeting steel, sparks flying. After a few more exchanges, the boy realized something terrible. He couldn't win. His class wasn't saving him, and his pride was about to take a fatal hit. So he decided to cheat like a true coward and called for backup. The second boy jumped in from behind, trying to catch Errol off guard, but Errol had senses sharper than their brains combined. He felt the attack coming, sidestepped smoothly, and watched as the two idiots bumped into each other mid-swing. Standing there watching them argue mid-battle about whose fault it was, Errol finally understood the truth. No class in the world could fix stupidity. While they were busy yelling, he dashed in like a shadow. One moment he was gone, the next he was under one of them, landing a clean uppercut straight to the jaw. The poor kid hit the dirt, eyes spinning. The other panicked and tried to rush in for revenge, but tripped over his own fallen friend. Errol didn't waste the opportunity. Another quick strike, another idiot down. Both boys lay flat on the ground, groaning in disbelief. Errol brushed the dust off himself and casually announced that he'd won. But the losers, bruised and humiliated, started whining that he caught them off guard. Errol, being the unbothered king he was, agreed to a rematch without hesitation. But before they could embarrass themselves further, a sharp voice cut through the field. A red-haired boy with a confident posture and the kind of aura that screamed main character rival told them to stop acting like fools. He said if they lost, they should take the L like real swordsmen instead of making excuses. The two boys froze instantly. One of them tried to talk back, but was quickly shut up by his friend, who whispered that the redhead was Captain Evan's son. That name alone was enough to make them tremble. Evan was the village's head of security and one of the strongest swordsmen around. The redhead stepped up to Errol, studying him like a judge inspecting a criminal. He asked if Errol was the son of Sword Princess Farah. When Errol confirmed, the redhead nodded, admitting that Errol's technique was solid, clearly a result of his mother's training. But he wasn't about to let Errol's win over those two weaklings impress him. He pointed his blade at Errol and declared that he wanted a real fight. The air got heavy. He announced that he'd show Errol the true power of a swordsman class, his tone dripping with pride. The two defeated boys whispered to each other, realizing this really was Evan's kid, the same Evan who used to team up with Errol's mom for monster hunts.
Errol looked at the boy's cute, delicate face and wondered how this baby-faced redhead could be that grumpy old man's son. Maybe puberty just hit different for their family. The boy's shoulders trembled, clearly fueled by daddy issues and jealousy. He spoke passionately about his father, a brave, wise swordsman who'd once been the pride of the village, and complained that Errol's mother had stolen the title of strongest swordsman. At that, Errol immediately understood what was going on. The guy wasn't here for honor. He was just salty that his mom was better than his dad. Errol pointed that out bluntly, and the redhead froze, face turning red for reasons beyond his hair color. Embarrassed, but trying to save face, he demanded to know if Errol also thought his mother was stronger than his father. Errol didn't even hesitate to confirm it. His mother was the strongest person in the village, and honestly, everyone already knew that. But the redhead wasn't about to let that slide. With pride puffing out of his chest like a rooster before a fight, he bragged that he inherited his father's unmatched swordsmanship. He swore he'd defeat Errol just to prove his family's superiority. After cooling off a bit, the redhead explained that he'd officially become a swordsman a year ago and had been training under his father ever since. With his experience and natural talent, he was absolutely sure he couldn't lose. Errol, meanwhile, just nodded with that calm, "yeah, sure, whatever" energy, and reminded him that he'd been trained by the sword princess herself. So no, he wasn't planning to lose either. The tension grew as both raised their swords. The redhead struck first, slashing down with confidence. Errol instantly parried and retaliated. Sparks flew. The clash of metal echoed through the field as the two went head-to-head like seasoned rivals. The audience, those two idiot swordsmen from earlier, stood frozen, jaws wide open. They couldn't believe their eyes. How the hell was a classless guy keeping up with someone born with divine buffs? As the redhead's attacks grew faster, Errol noticed something. The kid was strong, no doubt, but his moves were wild, driven more by anger than control. Errol stayed calm, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. But before he could land a clean hit, the redhead suddenly shouted and unleashed a special skill, the twin slice. Two lightning-fast slashes cut through the air, and before Errol could blink, the second strike sent him flying into a wall. For a second, the redhead looked stunned. His first attack had been blocked. Impressive for a classless nobody. But the second hit had drawn blood. Errol gritted his teeth, trying to stay on his feet. He asked what that move was, and the redhead smugly explained that it was a swordsman class skill, something a classless person could never block. Errol, stubborn as ever, just wiped the blood off and said he'd figure out how to block it with practice. The redhead paused for a moment, then gave a rare smile, impressed by Errol's sheer guts. A few days later, the morning peace in the house shattered when Errol's sister walked into his room and found him snoring like a corpse. She tried to wake him up with a morning kiss and instantly got rejected by a headbutt as Errol jolted awake. The poor girl staggered back, furious, demanding an apology kiss like some spoiled princess. Errol ignored her and dragged himself to breakfast where his mom, Farah, smiled like nothing happened.
As the family ate together, his sister asked if he was heading out to train again. When Errol nodded, she got annoyed and told him to take it easy. After all, she could take care of him if he needed. Errol didn't even reply. He just stood up and left, leaving her steaming with frustration. She wondered why her brother had suddenly become so obsessed with training ever since coming home covered in bruises. Farah decided to explain. She took her daughter outside and opened a wooden chest. Inside was a pile of broken swords, all snapped and shattered from endless practice. Her daughter's jaw dropped. Farah smiled proudly, saying Errol had been training harder than ever after that duel with the redhead. His determination had reignited her pride as a mother. Seeing that, his sister couldn't stay upset. She promised herself to create a world where classless people like Errol wouldn't be looked down on. Farah chuckled softly. Her daughter had inherited her brother's stubborn heart. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Errol was busy putting his body through hell. Sweat poured down his face as he slammed his wooden sword into a training post over and over. Then, with precise footwork and a deep breath, he unleashed it. The twin slice, the exact move that had beaten him. His blades cut through the air perfectly this time, slicing the post clean in two. He couldn't help but grin. The pain, the bruises, the beatdown from that redhead, it had all been worth it. But the forest had other plans. A goblin hiding in the bushes lunged at him with a club. Errol spun around in an instant, hitting it with the same twin slice and splitting the creature in half. He exhaled, proud of how clean the move felt. That victory moment didn't last long, though. A deep, monstrous roar echoed from behind. Turning around, Errol's heart skipped. A massive hobgoblin stood there, easily twice his size. He thought about running to the village security team, but then a blood-curdling scream rang out nearby. It was familiar, too familiar. Without thinking, Errol tightened his grip on his sword and sprinted toward the sound. Bursting through the trees, he spotted the redhead, blood dripping from his arm, his sword shaking, and right in front of him loomed the towering hobgoblin, ready to crush him like an ant. Errol quickly pieced it together. The redhead must have been training too, killed some goblins, and accidentally attracted their boss. The redhead backed into a corner, eyes wide as the monster raised its club for the final hit. Errol crouched behind a bush, searching for the perfect opening. He took a deep breath, focusing all his energy. As the hobgoblin swung down, Errol appeared like a flash of light. In one clean motion, he executed the same twin slice. And this time, it wasn't practice. The blade tore through the monster's chest, slicing it down the middle. The hobgoblin collapsed with a thunderous crash as Errol stood over it, breathing hard but grinning like a badass. And he did it using a skill that supposedly wasn't meant for him. Behind him, the redhead tried to move but stumbled forward, collapsing right into Errol's arms like some kind of awkward romance scene. Turns out the guy's protection blessing had run out, meaning he was one hit away from the afterlife. Errol sighed, asked if he had any holy water left, but the redhead just stared miserably at a shattered bottle on the ground.
Typical. So, being the decent human he was, Errol handed him his own holy water. One sip later, the redhead's wounds closed up like magic. But instead of saying thank you like a normal person, the guy looked pissed. Mainly because Errol, the so-called classless loser, had just saved his life again. Errol noticed the change in his mood and smirked as the boy grumbled a quiet thanks before immediately grilling him about that insane sword skill. Errol shrugged like it was no big deal and said it was just the twin slice. That made the redhead's eye twitch. He demanded to know how Errol learned a swordsman-exclusive move without even having a class. Errol simply told him the truth. He trained until his body broke, then trained some more. The redhead blinked, confused, so Errol explained that it wasn't about magic or divine blessings, it was about perfect timing, precise footwork, and pure stubbornness. He even admitted that getting his face smashed in by the redhead over and over had helped him figure it out. That one stung. The redhead looked like he'd just been told his life's purpose was a training dummy. Still, Errol thanked him for being his best teacher. Unintentionally, of course. Shocked, but secretly impressed, the redhead declared a rematch. Errol raised an eyebrow, asking if he was serious after almost dying 5 minutes ago. But the boy insisted. After all, he owed him one for saving his sorry hide. Errol couldn't help but laugh a little, surprised that this prideful brat actually knew how to repay favors. The redhead took offense, snapping that he wasn't that ungrateful. And so both boys drew their swords once again. The air grew heavy. The forest fell silent. Then they both unleashed Twin Slice at the exact same moment. Steel clashed in a blur, but Errol's reaction shocked his opponent. He blocked both of the redhead's strikes, and before the kid could even process that, Errol came in with something extra, a third slice. The redhead froze. He blurted out that it's called Twin Slice for a reason. Errol, wiping sweat from his brow, smirked and said that since he didn't have a class limiting him, he could shape his skills however the hell he wanted. This was his first successful triple slice. The redhead just stood there, jaw open, questioning his entire existence. Still not willing to admit defeat, he growled that a real swordsman's technique should never lose to a classless wannabe. Errol just smiled and told him they could test that theory with another match. They reset. The redhead calmed his breathing, thinking he had an edge this time. Speed. Both of them lunged again, twin slices flashing through the air. The redhead braced himself for that third slash, but Errol's movement was faster than before. The blow landed, knocking him down hard despite his block. Errol pointed his sword at him, declaring this outcome was expected. The boy groaned, asking how the hell his third strike was that fast. Errol chuckled and said, ironically, he learned it from him. He explained that he intentionally slowed the first two strikes, then poured all his strength and timing into the third, hitting like a truck when the opponent least expected it. Completely outclassed, the redhead clenched his fists, grinding his teeth in frustration as Errol calmly walked away, victorious yet humble as ever.
A few days later, during dinner, Errol's mom, Farah, casually dropped the news that Captain Evan's son, yes, our red-headed rival, had left to train in the city of Brucia. Errol nearly choked on his food, asking what the place was. Farah smiled proudly and explained that Brucia was known as the City of Swords, home to some of the best guilds and warriors in the world. She even admitted she trained there back in her younger, pre-marriage days. That immediately lit a spark in Errol. If that was where the strong went to grow stronger, then he was going too. Time flashed forward 5 years. Errol was on a carriage headed to Brucia, sharing a ride with two loudmouth swordsmen who couldn't stop arguing. One girl, clearly suffering from delusion, claimed that wearing less clothing made her stronger because it was part of her dual swordsman class. The guy beside her, equally cocky, argued that his class had way more offensive power. Their bickering was so painful that even the driver looked ready to jump off. Before anyone could tell them to shut up, the carriage suddenly screeched to a halt. A horde of wild orcs appeared ahead, and the driver, done with their trash talk, told the two prodigies to prove their strength. Instantly, their bravado died. Faces pale, weapons shaking, they crapped their metaphorical pants as the Orc King itself rose from the crowd. A random lady grabbed the guy's arm for safety, and in true hero fashion, he shoved her aside and bolted. The girl followed right after. Even the driver started turning the wagon to escape. But Errol, he quietly stepped forward. No fear, no hesitation. He unsheathed his sword and sprinted straight into the horde. The driver looked back in shock as Errol cut through orcs like butter, moving so fast he left after images. Then he disappeared completely before reappearing behind the horde in a spinning blur. Every orc dropped instantly. The driver's jaw hit the floor. That move, Blade Dance, was the signature technique of the legendary sword princess herself. But that made no sense. It was supposed to be exclusive to female class holders. Yet here was Errol, a classless dude, pulling it off like it was a Tuesday workout. The Orc King roared, swinging a weapon big enough to crush a house. Errol dodged it effortlessly, leaped high into the air, and drove his sword straight into the monster's skull. The beast fell with a ground-shaking thud, lifeless. Calmly landing, Errol wiped his blade clean and told the dumbstruck driver to take him to Brucia. When the man stammered that Errol was already strong enough, Errol smirked and said he still wanted to get stronger. From the back, a kid asked what class he belonged to, and the entire carriage fell silent when Errol casually revealed that he was completely classless. 5 years earlier, he had shown his mom the twin slice he'd mastered from the redhead's move. She'd been speechless, thinking she was dreaming. But when he explained he was learning new techniques despite having no class, she realized her son was a freak of nature. In a good way. She had proudly taught him her own sword princess techniques before sending him off to chase greatness. Errol's mom had bragged about him to everyone in the family after that. And as the carriage rocked gently toward Brucia, Errol drifted off, dreaming of battles, swords, and glory, until the driver's shout snapped him awake. They had finally arrived at the City of Swords.
When Errol finally reached Brucia, the legendary City of Swords, he was stunned. Everywhere he looked, there were swordsmen. Streets filled with shiny armor, smug faces, and more capes than common sense. He could practically smell the arrogance in the air. Looking around, Errol sensed several powerful warriors nearby, their sword auras radiating like neon signs saying, "Try me." Curious, he turned to the carriage driver and asked what class he was. The man awkwardly tried to brush it off, claiming he was just a regular guy. But Errol wasn't buying it. He pointed out that the driver had recognized all his techniques during the orc fight, something only a real pro could do. The driver chuckled nervously, realizing he'd been exposed. He finally admitted that he was actually an advanced holy knight, one of those saintly badasses who could smite demons before breakfast. Errol blinked in surprise and asked what a guy like that was doing driving carriages. The man just sighed, saying he did it to relax between battles. Sometimes you just need a break from saving the world, apparently. Errol nodded silently, respecting that logic. Even heroes needed chill days. Before parting ways, the driver gave Errol some advice. He told him to start by joining a sword guild. Brucia was famous for hosting swordsmanship tournaments, where warriors earned money, fame, and occasionally lifelong trauma. But he warned that Errol couldn't participate unless he was part of a registered guild. Hearing that, Errol's eyes lit up. He was ready to get started. After thanking him, he stepped into the city, his adventure officially beginning. He soon came across several guild halls. One was Calvar's Guild, recruiting elite knight swordsmen, while another was the Sword Road Guild, open to everyone. He was just about to pick one when chaos found him first, in the form of a girl. Out of nowhere, a girl sprinted toward him, arms wide open like she was about to hug a long-lost lover. Errol dodged on instinct, and she face-planted straight into the ground. She popped back up instantly, red-faced, but still grinning, shocked that he dodged her without even looking. She muttered something about him having crazy detection skills. Errol just stood there confused, wondering what kind of circus he'd walked into. The girl quickly switched gears, asking if he wanted to join a guild. Errol nodded out of politeness, and she instantly went into sales mode like some desperate recruiter. She pulled out a crumpled contract and began her pitch, talking so fast she might have memorized it in front of a mirror. Errol took one glance at the paper and started walking away without a word. Panicking, the girl grabbed his belt, demanding to know why he was leaving. Errol sighed and told her flat out she looked too desperate. He assumed her guild must be weak if she had to drag people off the street. Offended, she puffed her chest out, not that it made much difference, and tried to act like her guild was a big deal. Errol wasn't convinced. Realizing she was losing him, the girl introduced herself as Lilia and even offered him a date if he joined. Errol barely blinked and told her he wasn't interested. That hit harder than any sword strike. Lilia froze, visibly short-circuiting from the rejection. Errol thought she was just like his older sister, loud, overconfident, and about as flat as a wooden board.
Trying to change the topic, Errol asked her which guild was the biggest in Brucia. Lilia, still recovering from the ego damage, glared at him before sighing dramatically. She told him that Blackblade Guild was the top dog in the city, boasting 8 A-rank swordsmen. Errol thanked her and immediately walked off, leaving Lilia fuming behind him. He soon arrived at Blackblade's massive headquarters, which looked more like a castle than a guild hall. A guard stopped him and asked his business. Errol said he wanted to join, and the guard directed him to take the entry test. Errol followed and waited in line until his turn came up. When he reached the counter, the receptionist, a man who clearly loved his own voice, explained that only people with advanced classes could apply. Errol said he was classless, but still wanted to take the test. The receptionist burst out laughing, like he'd just heard the world's funniest joke, and told him to leave. People around began whispering, mocking Errol for even trying. Staying calm, Errol asked again, saying he was confident in his skills. But the receptionist refused, repeating the rule like a broken NPC. Before Errol could argue further, a few A-ranked swordsmen walked into the room, glowing like literal celebrities. The receptionist's tone changed instantly, his fake politeness returning as he ignored Errol completely. Realizing this place was full of arrogant clowns, Errol quietly turned and left. He tried visiting other guilds, but it was the same story everywhere. No class, no chance. By the end of the day, even his optimism had taken a hit. But then he remembered something his mother had given him before he left home. Back then, he thought it was just her being overprotective, but now it all made sense. She knew this would happen. Determined, Errol decided to find her old guild. As he was walking, Lilia reappeared out of nowhere like an annoying pop-up ad, begging him again to join her guild. He kept walking, ignoring her entirely. She got so desperate she yelled that she'd lick his boots if he joined. The whole street went dead silent. Townsfolk gave her the most disgusted looks imaginable, while Errol simply walked away faster, pretending he didn't know her. Lilia clenched her fists, vowing she'd make him join one way or another. After searching for a while, Errol finally found the place his mother had mentioned, a once grand building that clearly seen better days. Just as he approached, Lilia popped up again. Out of breath, she proudly pointed to the massive headquarters behind her, saying this was her guild. Errol blinked. That big and still weak? He couldn't believe it. Lilia admitted that her guild had lost its former glory,
but she was determined to rebuild it. She introduced it as the Dragon Thang Guild, once led by the legendary Dual Swords King. Hearing that name, Errol's eyes widened. His mother had told him stories about training in that very guild back in her youth. That was enough to get his interest, so he agreed to go inside. Lilia led him into a grand but dusty hall and offered him a seat. Before she could continue her recruitment speech, a drunk man suddenly rose from the sofa waving a bottle and yelling nonsense. Lilia's face turned red with embarrassment as she yelled at him, reminding him that the doctor had forbidden him from drinking. Not to mention, they couldn't even afford alcohol. The man just laughed, clearly not giving a damn.
Errol finally realized who he was, the Dual Swords King himself, the legendary warrior, now a one-armed alcoholic. The man glanced at Errol, scoffed, and told him to leave while he still could, saying this guild was finished. Lilia tried to stop him, but her father just ignored her and walked away like a retired celebrity who hated fan interactions. When things calmed down, Lilia explained that her father had once been one of Brucia's top swordsmen, but after losing his arm, his career and the guild both went downhill. She sighed, convinced that Errol would leave too, but instead Errol said he'd join. Lilia froze like her brain blue-screened. She thought he was joking, but Errol explained that every other guild had rejected him anyway. She squealed with joy, grabbed the contract, and handed it to him immediately. After he signed, she glanced at his paperwork and nearly fainted. She finally noticed the part that said Class None. Her smile disappeared. For a second, she just stood there, then calmly drew her sword and threatened to give him a new class, the Deceased One. Errol blinked, confused. She demanded to know why a classless guy dared join her guild, saying she needed real swordsmen, not freeloaders. But deep down, she was mostly just mad that the guy who roasted her earlier was actually joining her guild, and that he was still stronger than her. Just when Errol thought his new guild couldn't get any weirder, a woman walked in. Elegant, serious, and with an aura that screamed, "I'm the adult here." Her name was Rion. Before she could even say a word, Lilia jumped straight into her arms like a clingy puppy and whined that a classless scammer had tried to trick her. Rion looked over at Errol, froze for a second, and immediately recognized him. Errol blinked in confusion. Rion smiled and said they were from the same hometown. She even reminded him that they used to spar when they were kids. Errol stared blankly, trying to remember, and shook his head. Rion looked offended. She clarified that they'd met 5 years ago. That's when Errol tilted his head, smiled, and said he'd never forget a beauty like her. The flirty comment hit harder than her sword. Her face turned red as her hair. Then it finally clicked for him. That red-headed brat he fought years ago was her. Errol's eyes widened with realization, and Rion proudly confirmed it. She was Captain Evan's daughter and his only child. Errol immediately apologized for not recognizing her. Rion laughed it off, saying her long hair probably threw him off. Errol, ever the menace, thought to himself that it wasn't her hair that changed, it was her figure. His eyes instinctively drifted south, making her frown as if she could read his mind. Before the awkward tension could escalate, Lilia interrupted, asking if this was really the same classless boy who beat Rion years ago. Rion nodded, and Lilia gasped, half in disbelief, half in excitement. But Rion wasn't laughing. Her pride was still scarred from that defeat, and she wasn't planning to let it slide. She clenched her fists and declared she wanted a rematch.
Moments later, the three of them arrived at the guild's training ground. Lilia acted as referee while Rion stepped forward, determination blazing in her eyes. She admitted that Errol was strong, but this time she wouldn't lose. Errol smirked slightly, feeling the tension in the air. The match began. Rion charged first, swinging with a twin slash that glimmered in the sunlight. Errol, confident as ever, thought he could block it easily. Big mistake. The attack hit him square in the chest, sending him stumbling back. He looked down, stunned. His parry hadn't worked. Rion tossed her heavy sword aside and explained with pride that her weapon was 5 times heavier than normal. No way his technique could counter her brute strength. She revealed that she had awakened a brute swordsman class, which multiplied her power to ridiculous levels. Errol, still catching his breath, admitted she definitely leveled up since their last fight. The battle grew intense. Ryan's slashes were fierce, each swing heavy enough to break bones. Errol had to step back repeatedly, muttering that if he kept taking hits like this, he'd lose. What confused him was how casually she was revealing her strategies mid-battle. When he asked why, Ryan simply said beating him fair and square was worth the risk. That confidence made Errol grin. He told her power was nice and all, but she still couldn't keep up with his speed. Then he disappeared. One moment he was in front of her, the next, gone. Ryan's eyes darted around, and before she could react, Errol reappeared behind her and struck her neck with the blunt of his sword. She spun around in shock. What the hell just happened? Errol explained that what she saw was just a shadow afterimage. It was a move from the Supreme Swordsman technique, a style so advanced that even elite warriors struggled to master it. Ryan stood frozen, realizing that the same guy everyone mocked for being classless had somehow learned a supreme-level skill. She tried again, attacking in a flurry of rage, but Errol dodged every hit effortlessly. When she demanded to know how, he shrugged and said, "Just move faster." That line made her want to punch him more than ever. Errol chuckled, admitting it wasn't that simple. It had taken him years of hard work and broken bones to get it right. In a blur, he vanished again, striking her from different angles, but to his surprise, his blows didn't deal any real damage. Ryan smirked. She proudly explained that power swordsmen had enhanced defense as part of their class. Errol raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed, but not intimidated. When she came at him again, he sidestepped and countered with a perfectly timed strike, one he'd learned from his mother. Ryan froze mid-attack, and then her knees hit the ground. She'd lost. Lilia, still shocked by what she'd just witnessed, slowly raised her hand and declared Errol the winner. Ryan's face twisted in frustration. She had trained for 5 long years, and she still couldn't beat him. Errol walked over, praised her growth, and said she'd gotten way stronger. Then, in true Errol fashion, added that he was just stronger. But that broke her even more. Rian's eyes welled up with tears, but she tried to hide it. Lilia rushed in, glaring at Errol for making her cry. He looked confused. He'd literally just complimented her. Rian turned away, pretending she wasn't crying, before running back to the guild. But a few seconds later, loud sobs echoed from inside, proving otherwise. After that emotional mess, Lilia's mood did a complete 180. She happily accepted Errol into the guild, pretending like she'd believed in him all along. Errol glanced at her skeptically, remembering how she'd threatened to kill him 5 minutes earlier, but he let it go and asked why the guild was in such bad shape. Lilia sighed and awkwardly admitted they were in debt. Errol leaned closer to hear the number, and when she whispered it, even he looked shocked. But Lilia quickly said it wasn't hopeless. They could pay everything off if they won an upcoming tournament. She explained that they needed 3 members to compete. Errol asked why Rian was even staying with such a small-time guild. Lilia told him the truth. When Rian first came to Brussia, every major guild rejected her. Her father, however, had seen potential in her and offered her a place at Dragonfang when no one else would. Out of gratitude, she stayed loyal ever since. Hearing that, Errol nodded with respect. He told Lilia that winning the tournament would be a piece of cake. But Lilia didn't look so sure. The tournament teams had up to 5 members, and they only had 3. 1 drunk, one-armed man, 1 emotionally unstable girl, and a classless freak. Not exactly dream team material. Still, Errol's eyes gleamed with excitement. He didn't care about odds or risks. This was what he came for, to fight stronger opponents and prove that class or no class, he could surpass them all. And watching silently from the shadows, Lilia's father, the old guildmaster, smiled faintly, recognizing Errol's potential. The next morning, Errol woke up in an unfamiliar room, blinking at the ceiling like a man who just respawned in someone else's house. Then it hit him. He was now living in the Dragonfang Guild, the most broke, yet somehow functional guild in all of Brussia. He stretched, yawned, and stepped out into the main hall, where Lilia and Rian were already sitting at the breakfast table. Lilia greeted him with a grin and asked if he'd slept well. Errol nodded, saying it was the first time in ages he'd slept on an actual bed, instead of the cold ground. Rian, on the other hand, sat there completely silent, poking her food like it had wronged her. Errol eyed her, wondering if she was still salty about losing their last duel. Before he could open his mouth, Lilia clapped her hands with a burst of excitement. She proudly announced that Dragonfang was finally registered for the upcoming guild tournament. The girl was practically vibrating with energy. Errol tilted his head, asking if winning the tournament would really earn enough cash to cover all their mountain of debt. Lilia nodded and began explaining the rules like an overexcited teacher. The goal was simple: wipe out every member of the opposing guild to claim victory. Easy on paper, hell in practice.
Rian immediately frowned, pointing out that they were massively outnumbered. Most guilds had 5-man teams, while they barely had 3 functioning humans. Still, Lilia brushed it off with that fake optimism she was famous for, saying that there was a low chance they'd run into any A-ranked monsters in human form. Trying to stay positive, she reminded them that both she and Rian were B-ranked swordsmen, which technically made them strong. Errol blinked, confused as hell. Rankings? Letters? What kind of alphabet soup logic was this? Rian rolled her eyes so hard they almost left orbit. She explained that swordsmen were ranked from D to A based on skill and strength. There were only 20 A ranks in all of Brucia, so being a B rank was actually impressive. Lilia gave a proud little smirk, clearly satisfied with herself. Despite Errol's absurd strength, neither of them suspected he was anywhere close to A rank, since the gap between ranks was huge. Then, like she just remembered something life-changing, Lilia gasped and said the match pairings were being announced. Without waiting another second, she bolted out of the room like her rent depended on it. As she disappeared, Rian stood up too. Errol, curious, asked where she was going. She said she was off to train. Errol followed her with that "I've got a dumb idea" look in his eyes. He asked her to confirm that she was a power bladesman, then pressed further. Did she have any special skills aside from raw strength? Rian proudly mentioned her unique ability, Guts, a skill that boosted her protection barrier and kept her standing when normal fighters would have been face down in the dirt. That instantly caught Errol's attention. He grabbed her hand suddenly, saying he wanted to learn it too. Rian blinked, cheeks turning red, thinking this was some weird confession moment. But then Errol told her to beat him up with her sword, the sheathed one, thankfully. Rian just stared at him like he'd lost his damn mind. Errol told her that pain builds connection, and that getting smacked around by her would make them closer. She backed away, saying she wasn't into whatever freaky crap he was talking about. He sighed and explained that he only wanted to copy her Guts ability, reasoning that the best way to master endurance was to, well, endure getting wrecked. Rian facepalmed. She reminded him that class skills were blessings from the goddess, not something you could just copy-paste by brute force. But then Errol mentions that he'd already learned Twin Slice and Shadow Step without any class at all. That shut her right up. So she reluctantly led him to the training ground. When Errol asked to try her heavy sword, Rian smirked. That thing weighed 5 times more than normal. No way he'd even lift it. Then, to her horror, Errol casually picked it up like it was a stick. She was stunned, and he gave her that smug smile, saying it was thanks to countless hours of practice. He was confident he could learn her gut skill the same way. For the first time, she actually respected his dedication. She took a deep breath, drew her weapon, and warned she wouldn't hold back. Errol grinned, calling her a strong woman from his hometown, which of course made her blush like crazy again. Then training began. Or more accurately, Errol's daily beating began.
While Rian was busy smacking him around, Lilia came running down the stairs, screaming like the world was ending. She waved a paper in her hand and shouted that their first tournament match was against Blackblade, the strongest guild in the entire city. Lilia collapsed dramatically, crying that their enemies were basically a bunch of monsters in human form, led by the scummiest man alive, George, a man infamous for crushing weaker guilds just for fun. Still, even in her panic, Lilia clenched her fists and said they'd face their fate head-on. Then, she noticed Rian still hitting Errol and screamed at her to stop, thinking that they were fighting out of frustration. Rian rolled her eyes, explaining it was training, but Lilia didn't buy it. Errol just laid on the ground, groaning that he was starving. Lilia shoved a bottle of holy water into his face and told him to drink it instead of whining. Days passed, and before they knew it, tournament day had arrived. The massive Brucia Coliseum was packed with thousands of screaming spectators. Errol looked around, amazed by the crowd and the size of the arena. Nearby, he overheard some audience members talking about their match. Most were betting against Dragonfang, calling them a joke. Lilia's eyebrow twitched, ready to throw hands, but Rion held her back before she caused a scene. Then, Errol noticed the betting board. Their odds were 20-1. Lilia's jaw clenched, while Errol said that was actually a really high number. Lilia facepalmed. Nobody expected them to win. But instead of sulking, she suddenly grinned like a maniac. That's when she revealed her brilliant plan. She'd mortgaged her house and bet all their savings on themselves. If they somehow beat Blackblade, they'd be rich overnight. If they lost, well, they were homeless anyway, so what's the difference? Might as well go out in style. Then, as if summoned by their misery, George, the smug leader of Blackblade, walked over. He smiled with fake sympathy, praising Lilia for keeping her father's dying guild alive. He even brought up the classless hero she recruited, pretending to be impressed. Lilia glared, knowing damn well he was mocking her. George, however, kept that slimy grin plastered on his face, claiming he was simply sad to see Dragonfang fall so low. And just like that, the stage was set. A broke guild of 3 misfits versus the most powerful swordsman in the city. The crowd laughed, the bets were placed, and Errol, well, he cracked his neck and smiled. If they wanted a show, he was about to give them one. George stood tall in front of Lilia, wearing that smug smile only villains and tax collectors could pull off. He told her that he personally arranged this match because the crowd would go wild seeing the old strongest guild face off against the new strongest. Then, with a fake gentleman's tone, he claimed he'd even given her a chance to make some money off the bets, before laughing and saying it didn't matter anyway, since she'd never beat his A-rank swordsman. Lilia clenched her fist so hard her knuckles cracked, spitting that Dragonfang would crush him. George just chuckled and strutted away like a man who already wrote her obituary. Watching the whole exchange, Errol couldn't help but note how that guy managed to mock people politely, like he insulted you and complimented you at the same time. Moments later, the Coliseum roared to life. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, hyping up the crowd for what was clearly going to be a massacre. Errol glanced around and noticed George wasn't even stepping onto the field. For a second, he thought the guy might actually be merciful. But Lilia quickly reminded him that all of George's members were A-rank. Rion nodded grimly. This wasn't mercy. This was a power flex. Errol just smirked. He was actually excited to see what A-ranks were capable of. The announcer finally called the first match. Blackblade's Geo versus Dragonfang's classless hero, Errol. As Errol stepped into the arena, the crowd went off, not cheering, laughing. People whispered that Dragonfang must have lost their minds for sending out a classless weakling against an A-rank. Even Geo, his opponent, looked bored out of his skull, thinking he was getting the easiest paycheck of his life. As soon as the match began, Geo blurred forward with the teleport move and stabbed Errol right in the chest. Or so he thought. Lilia gasped, but Rion calmly said it was just a shadow clone. The fake arrow vanished into mist, leaving Geo's grin frozen mid-smirk. He spun around and stabbed again. Another shadow. Then he blinked, realizing there were 2 Errols now. Confused but still cocky, Geo activated his blink dash, slicing through both. But before he could even flex, a 3rd Errol appeared behind him. In a panic, Geo wiped out all 3, only to realize none were real. The actual arrow was already beneath him, delivering a clean knockout strike. Geo hit the ground like a sack of potatoes, eyes wide. He stammered, asking how the hell Errol could make 3 shadows. Errol shrugged and said his mom could make 5 without even trying. The audience went nuts. The announcer declared the winner, and the entire stadium erupted in disbelief. Lilia screamed with joy, while Rion stared at Errol like she'd just witnessed divine power. Even the medics carrying Geo away looked scared. Errol dusted himself off, thinking he still needed practice to copy Geo's critical strike technique.
Meanwhile, whispers spread through the stands. How could a classless kid just wipe an A rank before anyone recovered? The second match started. The next swordsman lunged at Errol, but Errol parried every hit like he was swatting flies, then ended the fight instantly with twin slice. Another knockout. The third challenger, a dagger user, tried to rush in with close combat. Bad idea. Errol vanished and reappeared behind him like a ghost before decking him in the back of the head. 3 matches, 3 wins. The crowd was stunned. Even Rian whispered to Lilia, asking why she wasn't fighting. Lilia just crossed her arms and said, "Because I like living." Then came the 4th fight against a shield bearer built like a walking fortress. Errol dodged the man's every move, earning a snarl from the opponent, who accused him of faking being classless. Errol smirked and said he just worked his ass off to get this far. The man scoffed, saying, "Classes can't be surpassed with effort alone." Then he feinted with his sword and charged with the shield, but Errol predicted it perfectly and countered with foresight, sending the man stumbling backward.
The crowd gasped as the shield flew from his hands. The guy realized Errol had learned his counter technique just from watching him. Errol tested it again, landing a perfect counter kick, then picked up the shield himself. The opponent charged in rage, and Errol sidestepped, slamming him down with his own move. The announcer shouted Errol's 4th consecutive victory, and the entire arena went silent. People began questioning if he was truly classless. The organizers demanded proof. Errol calmly handed over his class card, and the announcer inserted it into the crystal ball. The orb glowed, confirming he really was classless. George started sweating bullets. Rian whispered that maybe they actually had a chance. Lilia nearly fainted, not from stress, but from regret. If she'd known Errol was this strong, she would have bet the family dog too. Rian wondered how on earth he'd trained like this in just 5 years. Lilia, meanwhile, was already daydreaming about marrying him, muttering that even if the guild went bankrupt, she'd rebuild it with love. Errol noticed her creepy aura and instinctively stepped back. Then the announcer called the final match, Black Blade's Master Masamune versus Dragon Fang's classless hero. The crowd hushed. Masamune stepped forward, drawing a katana, and Rian instantly recognized him as a rare samurai-class swordsman. No one had ever seen him fight before, clearly George's secret weapon. The two squared off. Masamune didn't move an inch, calmly resting his hand on his blade. Errol felt the pressure in the air. This guy wasn't normal. Masamune smirked, saying he was just waiting for Errol to get close so he could finish it in one strike. Errol grinned and started walking forward, saying standing still wasn't his style. Masamune warned that once he drew his blade, Errol wouldn't even see the attack coming. Errol told him that was fine. He just wanted to see it up close. In a flash, Masamune drew his sword, slicing with blinding speed. The audience gasped, but Errol vanished right before impact. The samurai froze. Behind him, Errol appeared calmly, saying that Masamune's speed was impressive, but his teacher, the Sword Princess herself, was far faster. Then Errol unleashed Piercing Tempest, the legendary Sword Princess finisher, tearing through Masamune's defense and slamming him into the dirt. Silence filled the arena before the announcer declared Errol the winner. The entire crowd lost their minds. Bets were ruined. People screamed, and the Black Blade Guild's fans demanded refunds. Rian and Lilia rushed to celebrate, while Errol just stood there looking chill as ever. Lilia tried to hug him, but he instinctively sidestepped, letting her crash to the ground. He apologized, saying it was just reflex. His older sister used to ambush him like that. Lilia, still on the floor, just laughed, thinking about all the money they'd won. Rian, flustered, opened her arms for a hug too, until she realized how awkward she looked and froze. Errol grinned, saying he wouldn't mind hugging her without the armor. Lilia instantly jumped up to volunteer instead, so he dodged her again. As the crowd cheered their underdog victory, George clenched his teeth so hard it echoed through the arena. The great Black Blade Guild had just been humiliated by a classless kid, and judging by the look in his eyes, he wasn't going to let that slide.
That evening, when the Dragon Fang trio returned to their guild house, the place instantly turned into a party zone. and Lilia was already 3 mugs deep. Errol couldn't believe she was actually old enough to drink. She looked more like a middle schooler than a guild leader. But the short queen proudly claimed she was a grown woman despite having a flat chest. Still, she couldn't stop fangirling over Errol. After all, he had just single-handedly demolished 5 A-ranked swordsmen, members of the strongest guild in the nation. To her, this man wasn't just a hero, he was a golden ticket out of poverty. So, with the confidence of a drunk romantic and the desperation of a broke businesswoman, she suddenly asked for Errol's hand in marriage. She even promised she could fulfill all his desires, though judging by her size, no one was sure what that meant. But Errol, being the certified Sigma male, turned her down instantly. He casually said he'd prefer someone like Rion instead. That line hit harder than any sword. Rion's face turned bright red as she stood up, yelling at him to stop talking nonsense just to reject Lilia. But Errol wasn't joking. He said it completely seriously. When Rion asked why he was teasing her, he reminded her that years ago, during their childhood sparring, she used to complain that he called her a boy. She pouted, saying everyone who met her said she had no womanly charm. Errol smirked and glanced down, saying he could clearly see 2 very convincing reasons to disagree. That made Rion blush even more, while Lilia realized that Rion still had no clue how dangerous she could be if she actually leaned into that strength. Not one to give up, Lilia decided to make her move again. She leaned close to Errol, rubbing his leg, and said he must be tired from all the fighting, suggesting he join her in the bedroom. Lilia just gave a sly smile and claimed she was talking about a massage. To everyone's surprise, Errol said he'd rather get a massage from Rion. His idea of a massage is like getting beaten half to death in the training yard. Within minutes, the two were out there sparring like maniacs under the moonlight while Lilia watched from the balcony, wondering if Errol even knew what the word massage meant. Their chaos woke up Lilia's father, the legendary dual swords king, who stumbled downstairs, hungover and irritated. He barked at them to stop venting their loser frustration in the middle of the night. But when Lilia proudly told him they had actually won, and against the Black Blade Guild no less, he froze. Thinking it was a joke, he said the other guild probably sent their B or C rank rookies. Lilia corrected him with a grin. All 5 were A ranked, and Errol soloed every one of them. That snapped Rod sober instantly. He stared at the beaten up but smiling Errol like he was seeing a myth come to life. Lilia bragged that she'd also made a ton of bets and hit the jackpot, meaning their guild was now debt-free and rolling in extra cash. But Rod wasn't impressed. He grumbled that even if Errol was that strong, someone would soon poach him away to a richer guild. Lilia waved it off confidently, saying she'd secure Errol soon by marrying him. Errol immediately shot that down, saying, "No way in hell!" Then turning to her dad, he said that while Lilia might be loud and a bit dumb, at least she wasn't someone who gave up easily. That comment didn't go unnoticed. It was a direct jab at Rod. The old man's expression darkened. Errol, completely unaware of the danger, kept going. He told Rod to stop sulking and start acting like a swordsman again, since he still had one good hand to fight with. Rod's face twitched. He grabbed Errol by the collar and growled that a dual-wielding swordsman without 2 swords is nothing but a useless. But Errol shot back, saying that even a classless swordsman like him was still fighting and rising higher, so there's no excuse for giving up. Rod's glare lingered before he shoved Errol away and went back upstairs silently.
Lilia apologized for her father's behavior, but Errol brushed it off, saying the man was still incredibly strong. It was just a waste to see him throw that strength away. Deep down, Errol decided that no matter what, he'd motivate Rod to pick up the sword again. When Lilia overheard him talking about learning new skills, she suggested he try clearing dungeons nearby. Then she mentioned the Sword God Cup, a national tournament where the best swordsmen competed to prove who was number 1. That immediately caught Errol's attention. Before he could ask more, Lilia pulled out a form and told him to sign it if he wanted to enter. But Errol narrowed his eyes, realizing she was up to something. Without hesitation, he ripped the paper apart. Rion gasped, asking if he didn't want to join. But Errol said the paper wasn't a tournament entry, it was a damn marriage certificate.
Lilia laughed nervously, saying she was just testing the waters. Errol, however, was done playing around. He grabbed her into a rear naked choke, telling her she needed a lesson in boundaries. The next morning, Errol woke up to find Lilia trying to climb onto his bed. He dodged instantly, tied her up like a criminal, and left the room before she could pull any more stunts. Later that day, the trio headed to the city's dungeon teleportation hub. Lilia explained how adventurers use the magic circles to jump to levels they had already reached. She proudly said she'd cleared up to level 12, while Rion flexed her level 14 record. Errol, of course, immediately said he wanted to go to level 14 too, but Lilia told him it didn't work like that. He had to physically reach a level before he could teleport back to it. That crushed his excitement, but Lilia quickly added that she knew a shortcut to reach lower floors faster. Errol agreed, but when Lilia tried to ditch Rion, saying he didn't need two guides, he caught on to her scheme and insisted Rion come too. As soon as they entered the first floor, two armored knights attacked. Errol drew his blade, clashing with one, while Rion handled the other. Despite their heavy armor, the knights moved with unnatural speed. Errol used dash step, slicing one's head off, but to his horror, the body kept moving. He realized the suits were empty, animated by dungeon mana. Rion warned him that they didn't feel pain or have weak points, so Errol switched tactics, cutting off its legs instead. The knight collapsed instantly. Rion finished hers as well, saying they'd regenerate soon, so they needed to move deeper. But before moving any deeper into the dungeon, Errol turned to Lilia and asked what her class was. She proudly puffed up her chest, what little of it she had, and announced that she was a fencer. Then, with her usual shameless grin, she said she could teach him anything he wanted, whether it be in the training ground or, in the bed. Errol immediately rejected her again and walked off, leaving her speechless. Before they could descend to the next level, they suddenly heard faint cries for help echoing from beyond a nearby door. When they rushed over, they found a man kneeling on the ground, drenched in blood, begging them to save his friends who were still trapped inside. Rion suggested they take him back to the surface, but the man refused, saying his party got caught in a booby trap and were still alive somewhere inside. Lilia, being Lilia, went straight to business. She demanded payment up front before helping. Surprisingly, the man didn't hesitate and handed her a good chunk of money, apparently from gambling winnings.
But as they followed him, Errol's instincts started buzzing. He noticed that a guy losing that much blood shouldn't even be able to walk, much less lead them through a dungeon. Something was off. He quickly realized the injuries were fake. Still, instead of exposing him, Errol decided to play along, mostly out of curiosity and because he thought it might get entertaining. The man led them to a hidden chamber with trails of blood smeared on the floor and a glowing puddle at the center. In the middle of it sat a single gold coin. Lilia's eyes sparkled like a greedy goblin's, and before anyone could stop her, she reached for it. Instantly, a teleportation circle flared up beneath their feet. Everyone realized too late it was a trap, even the scammer himself, who screamed as he got teleported along with them. They landed on a floor deeper than any Rion had ever seen, even beyond level 14. The man started shaking, saying that this was the lowest floor of the dungeon where the mythical sword god was said to reside. Before they could question him further, a massive armored knight appeared before them, its body radiating rainbow-colored light. Lilia immediately called Cap. She didn't believe the sword god class was real, but Errol could already feel the pressure in the air. This was no joke. He shoved Lilia to the ground just as the knight unleashed a devastating aerial slash that ripped through the dungeon walls like paper. Without wasting a second, the sword god lunged at Errol. He barely managed to block the first strike, though it sent him flying into a wall. His arms trembled, realizing he only survived thanks to all that brutal reinforcement training Rion put him through. Errol charged forward again, swinging his blade, but the knight dodged with inhuman speed and countered with advanced sword techniques that blurred through the air. Instead of panicking, Errol grinned, calling it the perfect chance to test himself. His party looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but Errol activated Divine Step, vanishing in a flash to close the distance. He unleashed a flurry of attacks, forcing the sword god to back off. Then the knight raised its hand, and suddenly the gravity in the entire room multiplied.
Lilia and Ryan dropped to the floor instantly, unable to move. But Errol stood firm. He'd been through worse, specifically his mother's training sessions, where he could barely stand under her pressure. This time, he wasn't about to lose. The sword god raised its blade for another swing, but Errol pulled the gold coin from earlier and used it to nullify the gravity field for just a moment. That brief opening was all he needed. He unleashed his strongest move, Infinite Break, slicing through the night with enough force to shatter the air itself. Lilia and Ryan just stared in disbelief. Errol caught his breath, downed some holy water, and calmly activated a teleport spell to bring them all back to the surface. Later that night, back in the city, Lilia's father, Rod, was drinking himself half dead at a tavern again. Nearby, 3 loudmouth adventurers bragged about how they tricked Dragonfang's rookies into a dungeon trap and that they were probably never coming back. Rod slammed his fist into their table, shattering it, and demanded they explain everything. But before he could throttle them, George showed up, mocking him as a washed-up drunk.
The moment Rod saw him, everything clicked. George had set the whole thing up. His heart sank, believing his daughter was gone for good. He lunged at George, but the man easily shoved him aside. Rod fell to his knees, broken, cursing his own weakness. Just then, a familiar voice called out from the doorway. When Rod looked up, there stood Lilia, Ryan, and Errol, all alive and casually talking about being hungry. Lilia froze when she saw her father, and Rod immediately ran over, hugging her tightly in tears. Ryan glared at George and accused him of orchestrating the trap. She said one of his lackeys confessed everything, but George denied it smoothly, saying everyone's responsible for their own safety in the dungeon. Errol, strangely enough, said he kinda had a point, which earned him a death glare from both girls. Rod swore George wouldn't get away with it, but George just laughed, calling him a pathetic drunk and walking out. Errol simply sighed, knowing this wouldn't be the last of George's tricks. A few days later, a scroll arrived at Dragonfang, the preliminary match brackets for the Sword God tournament. When Lilia opened it, her heart sank. She was in the same bracket as Errol, meaning her chances of winning were exactly 0. Errol looked confused about how prelims worked, so Ryan explained that since thousands of swordsmen joined, the city split them into random brackets. Winners of each group got tickets to the main tournament. She also thanked the gods that she wasn't in Errol's group because she'd get shredded instantly. While she prayed for easy opponents, Errol teased her for having daddy issues. Lilia cut them off, saying it was time to hit the dungeon again for training. Errol groaned, saying he was tired of dungeons, but Lilia batted her eyes, saying she needed a strong man to protect her. Before they could leave, Rod appeared dramatically, hugging his daughter and warning her to be careful. George could strike again at any time. She promised she'd be safe and walked out. Rod caught Errol's judgmental look and awkwardly said he was trying to be a better dad. Errol smiled and said it's never too late to start acting like one. Weeks later, the preliminaries finally began. The arena erupted with cheers as countless swordsmen clashed. Slowly, the weak were weeded out, and predictably, Lilia lost before even facing Errol. She sulked in the corner while Errol roasted her, saying she was worried for nothing. She would have lost anyway. Crushed, Lilia still wished him luck, warning that his next opponent was a tricky one, a red-haired magic swordsman who could channel mana into her blade. Errol raised an eyebrow, surprised that magic was even allowed. Lilia shrugged, saying all you needed to enter was a guild badge. When the match began, the girl proudly introduced herself and warned him not to whine about magic being unfair. Errol smiled and said he didn't care. The best fighter would win. The fight started with the girl hurling fireballs non-stop. Errol dodged and deflected them like it was a dance, weaving through explosions until he finally got close enough to strike. She blocked, using another blast to push him back. Errol smirked, saying it must be convenient switching from melee to range so easily. She called him a classless loser who couldn't possibly beat her. Errol calmly replied that knowing both magic and swordsmanship didn't make her a master of either.
Furious, she poured fire into her blade until it blazed red hot, forming a flaming sword, boasting that only a true magic swordsman could wield it. She swung, and Errol just sidestepped the fire like it was nothing before slashing back with his own counterattack.
Even Errol had to admit that predicting the red-haired girl's next move was a nightmare. Her sword swings were fast, but her footwork looked like she was trying to dance on invisible marbles. Still, he respected the effort, saying she clearly trained hard, just not smart. After a few minutes, Errol decided to end this circus. He stopped moving altogether and began effortlessly deflecting every flaming strike without even taking a single step. The crowd gasped. The man literally stood there like a statue while her flames fizzled out against his blade. He told her that even though her swordsmanship was better than Lilia's, it was still sloppy, like a fancy moveset without any real depth. At this level, he said, the girl was barely stronger than the tutorial NPCs. That roast hit her harder than his sword could. Enraged and humiliated, she lost her cool completely. That's when Errol saw his chance. He unleashed a twin slice so clean that it sliced straight through her flaming blade and snuffed out her fire like a candle. Before she could even process what just happened, he blink-stepped behind her and smacked her in the head with his sword hilt, knocking her out cold. The crowd exploded in cheers as the announcer declared Errol the winner of the fourth block. But while everyone celebrated, Errol was already thinking about how to copy and master her flame techniques. Because, of course he was. A few days passed, and the day of the final tournament finally arrived. Lilia barged into her father's room, yelling at him to wake up so they could go cheer for both Errol and Ryan, who had also made it into the main event. Her father, Rod, just groaned and told her to go by herself. She tried to bait him into coming by mentioning that maybe he was scared to see George there. That hit a nerve. Rod instantly sat up, insisting he wasn't scared of that bastard. But then his shoulders slumped, and he admitted quietly that he'd tried picking up his sword yesterday and realized just how rusty he'd become. She scolded him for acting pitiful, reminding him that even in his condition, he could still go toe-to-toe with finalists, while others trained their whole lives and didn't even qualify. That fired him up again, and he finally agreed to go watch. On the way to the stadium, Rod thought about how he once trained Ryan when he still had both arms. He felt a strange mix of pride and nostalgia, wondering how his student would perform now. Meanwhile, inside the tournament grounds, Ryan was nervously tapping her leg, clearly on edge. She looked like she wanted to throw up. Out of nowhere, Errol popped up behind her, asking if she was scared that their first match might be against each other. She jumped, blushed, and tried to punch him right as the judges announced the first match of the main event, Errol versus George, the reigning champion. Ryan wished him luck, and Errol headed to the arena. Lilia yelled from the stands, telling him to kick that bastard's ass into 64 pieces.
But as soon as George walked into the light, Errol froze. Something was wrong. His eyes glowed purple, fangs jutted out of his mouth, and a dark horn protruded from his forehead. He looked less like a man and more like someone who made a deal with the devil. Rod immediately realized what had happened. He saw the sword in George's hand and shouted for Errol to retreat. That weapon was cursed. Trapped inside it was a powerful demon. George's voice even sounded distorted as he laughed, saying he didn't expect anyone to recognize him. Rod explained that George wasn't speaking. It was the demon inside him. That blade was once the legendary sword of the sword god, used to slay the Demon King ages ago. But before dying, the Demon King cursed the blade itself, turning it into a prison for his soul. The sword was supposed to be sealed away forever. The demon smirked and introduced himself as Gelda, the destroyer of mankind. He said he had waited centuries for someone greedy enough to set him free, and George was that fool. The entire stadium erupted into panic. Even Ryan stepped outside saying she thought Gelda was just a bedtime story. The monster said to have nearly destroyed the entire world. As chaos broke out and people tried to flee, Gelda raised his hand. A massive magic circle lit up beneath the arena, forming a shimmering dome that trapped everyone inside. He laughed like a maniac, saying human screams were the sweetest music he'd ever heard, and he planned to enjoy every note before killing them all. But in the middle of all that, one person didn't move. Errol. Gelda sneered, telling him to run if he valued his life. But Errol calmly replied that he didn't need to, because the demon had already been defeated once before, which meant he wasn't invincible. The demon burst into laughter, reminding him that last time it took a sword god to beat him, and there were no sword gods left alive. Errol smirked and said he wasn't so sure about that. His mother was still alive after all.
The moment he said that, Gelda's laughter stopped. Then Errol vanished. He dashed forward using Divine Step, the exact technique of the sword gods, catching the demon off guard. Gelda barely blocked as Errol struck from every angle, moving faster than the eye could follow. The demon grinned through the chaos, reminding him that George's body was that of a sword emperor, meaning Errol's attacks weren't enough. Then Gelda countered with a devastating blow that sent Errol crashing into the arena floor. The demon smirked, certain the fight was over. But when the dust cleared, Errol stood up, barely scratched. All that insane training with Ryan had paid off. Gelda lunged again, but this time Errol parried smoothly, deflecting every hit and responding with his own infinite break, a whirlwind of slashes so fast they blurred into one. The demon staggered backwards, overwhelmed. For the first time in centuries, Gelda felt fear. He couldn't believe a human boy was using techniques only a sword god should know. Before he could recover, Errol struck one final devastating blow. The impact tore through the demon's body, and George collapsed in a heap. The crowd erupted, cheering, crying, losing their minds. But their victory was short-lived. The sword itself began glowing. Gelda's laughter echoed again as his spirit left George's body looking for a new host, and lunged straight toward Rod. Errol tried to act fast, shoving Ryan aside, but Rod stepped forward to protect his daughter. When the smoke cleared, Rod was standing there clutching the demon sword with its edge pressed against Lilia's throat. Errol cursed himself for not realizing earlier that the demon's true body was the sword. Gelda, now inside Rod, threatened to kill Lilia if Errol made a move. But Errol stepped forward anyway, saying confidently that Gelda couldn't hurt her. The demon tried, but the hand holding the sword wouldn't move. Rod's body was fighting back. Rod roared, forcing the demon down, then slammed the sword into the ground. As Gelda screamed, Rod ripped the blade free and hurled it toward Errol. Without hesitation, Errol swung his sword, shattering the cursed weapon into pieces, finally ending the demon once and for all. The stadium fell silent. But that's where this episode ends.